Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. If you haven't heard of Timothy Fadek, you will have seen his photos. They appear on the front pages of newspapers and websites around the world. He's also won countless awards for his work, and most recently, he's been in Ukraine, just one of the many conflicts he's covered over the past 20 years. And he's with us now to discuss his work. Hello and welcome, Tim.
Hello, Nicholas. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I'm good. It's really good to have you with us. It's going to be a really good discussion over the next hour. We do have photos of yours to look at, and I'll talk about them in just a second. Iraq, Libya, you've documented the September 11th attacks and their aftermath. Kosovo, you're also noted for your work that also documents people's lives, from reindeer herders to life in the Sawalki Gap. And some of our travellers will be familiar with that place. We'll talk about that too in a second. You've got an approach that I think takes you closer to the story than many photographers, and we're going to get to the heart of that in a second. First of all, just the really obvious question: how did you start out? I mean, you didn't start out as a news photographer, did you? Straight from school or college?
No, that's correct. My path to becoming a photographer was a little bit convoluted. When I graduated from college, I had a business degree. My first job was actually as a junior account executive at an advertising agency in New York. And then a second job as a senior account executive in Frankfurt, Germany. And I did that up until the age of 28, and then quit completely, not just the job, but the industry itself. Just, I had enough. Returned. I spent a few months in Frankfurt, just, I bought a camera, just playing around with it, a pure amateur. But it wasn't until I met a German photojournalist with a local newspaper. They just sort of explained to me what is possible in the world of photography. So I returned to the US, New York, and I enrolled at the School of Visual Arts, where I took random photo classes, but with a keen interest on photojournalism. Did that for a couple of years. And then once I had amassed a collection or a portfolio of my student work, or teacher assigned work for those classes, I started showing it around. And I dropped off the portfolio in numerous places, including the New York Times, where it stayed under the desk of the assigning editor for nearly a month, until I called him and harassed him a little bit, like, can we talk? He finally got to look at it, brought me in. I met a lot of editors, and soon enough, he asked me to buy a pager, because back then in '97, cell phones were not ubiquitous, nor were they cheap. So it was the old-fashioned way of paging me, and then I would call them back, and they would over the phone tell me what the assignment was. And that's how I started, 1997, working for the New York Times. That's how I launched my career.
That's a pretty damn good place to start, isn't it?
It was, yes, very rigorous training, in the sense that, number one, I was shooting film. I'd had to finish the assignment, go to the actual photo desk on the fourth floor at that time. And while the film was being processed, I'm sitting at a terminal typing the captions, and it all had to be done the same day. These days with digital, you still have to do the same thing, but you send in your pictures, your digital photos, but you still have to caption each photo, and the rigor of editing and captioning all within the span of one day immediately after the assignment is excellent training for anyone. Even if one branches off to, like, magazine photography, where you have the luxury of time, a week or weeks or months, you still have to daily, as a matter of course, type your captions, because you'll forget what you shot if you put it off too long.
I mean, needless to say, this all absorbing. This was your life. You knew that there was nothing else. I mean, it's like I think I can think of reporting in a way as like a drug, but I think photography even more so.
I have to admit that there's maybe two things that are, might be considered selfish, meaning that although I'm covering big events and world world events with my camera, it didn't start that way. I felt a certain artistic need to interpret the world as I saw it, and I kind of fell in love with black and white photography, developing it in my home darkroom. I just love the process, the artistic process of seeing an image literally appear before your eyes in a tray of developing bath. And I found it interesting or fascinating rather, how the image that would appear was quite different from the world that I saw. And I learned later on what that really is. It's the idea of translating a three-dimensional world onto a two-dimensional plane. And that transformation itself is, for me, fascinating. The other thing is that I like to travel, and I find it rewarding personally, in meeting people in different countries and different cultures. And I don't think I would have the same personal access if it wasn't for what I do for a living.
We're going to talk about how you've approached photography in a second, and also how that's developed. And I do think that your approach is quite unique, in that you're able to encompass a story within. I mean, I guess is the key to a really good photographer, and particularly a news photographer. It's trying to capture a picture that tells a very powerful story. And how you, I think what we're going to try and do is find out how you managed to do that. And we've got some slides, we've got some of your photos, and I should warn people from the outset, we're going to be looking at some very difficult subjects. And the two stories that Timothy has chosen for us today, one is about the earthquake in Haiti, and it involves dead people and lots of dead people. I warn you straight out that these photographs are quite shocking. So if that's not your thing, you need to sort of tune out straight away. And then the other one is that, as we talked about earlier, is the conflict in Ukraine. So Tim, I think part of this is trying to get yourself to the story and trying to get there. That's part of it, is the part of the preparation. But let's just bring up the slides as we talk about that.
Okay.
Getting both of these destinations are difficult to get to. And that's one thing. And then the second thing is, what do you show? And we're going to look at that in just a second.
So even though what I sent you was Haiti first and Ukraine second, I think I'm going to actually reverse it to talk about Ukraine first, because it's just more relevant. You see my slide? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I actually start off with this one photograph for the reason that we can discuss the idea of planning. This is 1 year, or maybe I should say, let me count the number of months, 6, 7, 8 months before the war, before the invasion began. And this is an American soldier who is a military advisor teaching a Ukrainian soldier how to prepare for an ambush off the side of a road. This was a photograph that I shot in Yavoriv training facility, which is in way in the western part of Ukraine, an hour from the Polish border. It's one of the biggest military training centers in all of Europe, if not the world. And it's not just Americans who were training, but it's also Canadians and the British and Australians and other NATO countries. And the reason I'm showing this is because the war, people sometimes forget that this war has been going on for 8 years, since 2014. And the buildup of training is the direct result of intel that I assume that they had, that there was a Russian military buildup taking place. And I learned about this sort of through, networks of people that I have a lot of contacts in government, and I have, a lot of policy friends and so on. And they informed me back in July of 2000 or June of 2021, keep your eye on Ukraine. And I already made one trip to Ukraine. I was there, but I did not fully embrace the possibility that there would be an invasion. But NATO was training for it. They were expecting it. And so when I had the opportunity to photograph the training, I thought it would be a great sort of wake up call for anyone. And by the way, just to interrupt myself, did not have an assignment, but my photo agency that distributes my work was able to place these photos as part of the bigger story in magazines such as Foreign Policy. But I wanted to just bring this slide up and talk about it quite a lot because of the amount of research and planning that and focus that I like to do for a story, meaning I like to know everything about the geopolitics, for example, before I even take my camera out of my bag. And so that led me to returning later, 6 months later, in Ukraine in January, early January. I guess what tipped me off that an invasion was going to happen imminently was when I read that there was a cyber attack on more than 70 Ukrainian government offices. And I thought this is the precursor to a physical land invasion. You start by attacking them.
And where are you at this point, Tim?
So anyway, thank you for please. I feel free to keep on doing that. This is in Kharkiv, and it is training by a militia, the Azov Battalion, and they were training civilians on how to fire weapons. And this is about maybe a month before the invasion, maybe 5 weeks before the invasion. So I wanted to just say that, and I learned quite a lot about the movement or the activity of these training sessions in the oddest of ways, using Facebook. All of these, all these battalions and all of these training events were all on Facebook. All you had to do was find the right group. I also employed the services of a fixer. And for those of you who don't know what a fixer is, it's basically a person who's like a local on-the-ground producer who speaks the language, has probably worked with journalists before, but most importantly, they're extremely connected to all the people and organizations that are part of the story that you're working on. So, when I was asking about civilian training, she just opened up her computer and she's like, oh, look, Facebook. And so she shared these Facebook pages with me. This picture is now we're actually like the invasion has started.
So just to come back a second, Tim. So
sorry about that.
You'd gone out in July, and then when did you fly back over again? In December, January? When did you actually go out for this? Just before the
early January. I think January 8th or 10th.
Right.
It's like 5 or 6 weeks before the war began, before the invasion began.
Sorry, it's cold here. Got to keep the fire going.
Fine.
So just before January. So in January, this is Kiev. Is this right?
That's right.
Yeah. So that's Kharkiv, the first one, and then you're back in Kiev for the refugees leaving.
Yes, exactly. So the other thing is that, and we'll talk about later, once the invasion began, or even like the day or two before the invasion began, the main airport in Kiev was closed because of the heightened risk of commercial and civilian aircraft being shot down. But in general, just logistically, it's not the easiest place to get around. One needs, I don't know if you want to discuss things like that in terms of like the nitty gritty nuts and bolts of.
I'm sure we'll get questions about that in a second when we've gone through the photos. So let's keep talking through the photos, and we'll talk. But getting around is complicated when you don't have. You might have train system, but the roads are blocked. You've got security. You've got checkpoints all the time. You've got people being nervous on the checkpoints.
Yeah. So exactly. And so I'm going to go to the next one, and this is The first set of photographs that we were making, that I was making, was the panic and the exodus and the evacuation of civilians from all the major city centers. And this is in Kiev, or Kiev, I should say. Kiev is maybe the Russian pronunciation. This is all guesswork. I mean, I was, I had the luxury of time because I was already in the country for 5 weeks before the invasion. So I was able to think about all the other conflicts that I had photographed in the past, and what's the usual timeline of events when things start breaking down. And the first thing, of course, is people trying to leave. What's interesting is that this was anticipated for weeks, but I think that Ukrainians themselves just could not believe that such a thing could happen, that their brotherly neighbor, Russia, would launch an invasion. And right up until the morning that it began, I don't think Ukrainians, and people were still at the bars and restaurants, they were either in denial or refused to believe. So anyway, it happened, and then there was a mad rush out of the city by car and a mad rush of people to the main train station. And of course, that's one of the first places I went to, is the train station. And I spent not just hours, but I returned day after day after day to the train station, because knowing that it's really hard to make pictures when you are being jostled in the middle of a crowd of hundreds and thousands of people.
Mm.
I can't remember the guy's name, the soldier's name, but that's his daughter on the train.
Right. Wow.
And just to give you a sense, still at the same main train station, a man and a woman, presumably, they're either related or they're somehow clearly emotionally connected. And this is the kind of thing where men have to stay behind. They were given the edict to remain behind, allowing women and children to leave the major cities and travel west, either to Western Ukraine or to Poland or other countries.
Yeah.
So the scene was very tearful, as this played out multiple times, countless times actually, when I was there.
Did anybody give you a hard time? I mean, obviously it's very crowded, it's very stressful. As you as a photographer, the difficulty is you're always looking on and sort of prying in.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I did indeed have, and we all did have, an incredibly difficult time. I think the basis for the antagonism toward me and other photographers was this was not the image that they wanted portrayed. Ukrainians like to think of themselves, and rightfully so, and accurately so, as a nation of dignified civilians, and the pushing and shoving and the sheer fear and chaos that was taking place. I think they felt, my guess was they felt a little bit embarrassed and ashamed of how they were conducting themselves, and they did not want this recorded. Oddly, I noticed television cameras, they did not give the same or react the same way to the television.
That's interesting. It's the idea of taking one shot, one particular freezing an image. That's
exactly.
Yeah.
I had multiple people, women, men, yelling at me, grabbing my cameras. One guy, I walked away from him, and he followed me throughout the train station to make sure that I stay away from the passengers. But I've encountered this at Lower Manhattan on 9/11. I've encountered this everywhere I go, and I'm telling you, it's always the same. People find themselves in these photographs, and they reach out to me months or years later asking for a copy of the photo. I think it's just a matter of time before they recognize that the role that these photos play in terms of the long-term historical significance finally dawns on them. But in the heat of the moment, they're also probably really scared and angry, and it's a natural human thing to sort of
you're the interface with the rest of the world in a way. I mean, you represent something that's outside of their immediate family and somebody to get angry with. What's the
exactly.
next slide?
So yes, then it became really serious, and there were missiles and artillery and other aerial bombardments taking place in Kyiv, and this was just a matter of what I'd like to call chasing smoke, and it's really nothing more than the only way you can find out when an attack happens is by luckily even though I was in a lower floor hotel not too far away, there's another hotel. I went to the top 15th floor rooftop level, and I was able to scan the skyline looking for the smoke because I heard the explosion, and just basically talked to my fixer and a few other people, and we're able to localize where it was, and we drove there. Again, chasing smoke. So a lot of this picture was actually much later, and the fires had been put out. But I liked it I made this photo and I'm showing it because it's just showing various juxtapositions between the violence of the damage in the background with the I should say the playfulness or the innocence represented by the slide, and then the mother and daughter all in one frame. And I just felt that it, rather than just show one-dimensional photos of just fire, smoke, and destruction, I'd like to have multiple layers.
The next photo, I think many people have seen this scene here, and this really was perhaps at the right at the beginning, just the mark of how distressing the very early days of the conflict, and it's really brought it home. So this is south of the suburb to the north of Kiev, which begins to get cut off from the rest of the city.
Correct. That's Irpin. And the day before, there were very dramatic photos that I did not make because I was actually doing something else, but that's not the point, showing just unbelievable scenes of civilians who were underneath the bridge, waiting for the go-ahead from Ukrainian soldiers saying it was safe. There was constant bombardment of the entire area, and it was really unsafe to be there. The mass of civilians had left the day before, and it was now down to a relative trickle when I arrived. And in this case, what you don't see, because strangely, based on the angle of my camera, the mother and father of this baby they are actually right behind the soldier, but you can't see them. The soldier's, close enough to the lens that perspective-wise, he's blocking the parents. But I witnessed what happened. They were carrying all these bags, plus a baby. And so the soldier offered to carry the baby while they carried the bags. And that's basically the situation. It happened very quickly. In fact, I think the soldier was so fit and so fast that he marched or climbed over the rubble so quickly right toward me. I didn't even have time to fully raise the camera to my eye. It's one of those kind of pictures that, you sort of make from chest level. He caught me by surprise, I think. But anyway, this is the famous Irpin Bridge that was deliberately destroyed by the Ukrainians to slow the tank advance, the artillery and tank advance by the Russians. And it was things like that, flooding roadways and flooding entire villages, destroying the bridges, that in large part prevented the Russians from actually gaining a foothold in Kyiv.
Just a little bit further south from there, I think it was on the day before, Lindsay Dario was taking photographs, and I think they were filming it. And the Russians were deliberately shelling the civilians as they were leaving this area.
That's correct. And it's extremely dangerous. There was a family of 3 were killed, or maybe a family of 3 plus an unrelated civilian. And when I was there and making this photograph, I remained for another 2 hours roughly. We had to take cover because the area was being shelled, and it was extremely dangerous. I even had to take cover actually underneath that white truck behind the soldier. Yeah. It's not it's a different kind of war. It's not shooting war. Shooting wars, as you know, you can sort of gauge your level of involvement based on how close you are to the front line. However, when you're dealing with mortars and artillery that have a range of 25 or 30 miles, there's no telling what could happen.
Yeah, it's a war on a different scale.
And this is interesting because I'm moving on to this slide for a reason, because with the discussion of the risk of injury and death coming from the air, the subway, or the metro, I should say, became one of the likely destination points for people trying to escape. And this is not in Kiev, actually. This particular subway is in Kharkiv, but it was built at a time. It's relatively deep enough, and a very good place to take shelter.
And ironically, those subways were built in part with the idea of being bomb shelters as well. So you can actually
That's correct.
You can see the steel doors in some of those areas. So it's ironic that it was built in Soviet times and used in this way.
Just to add one thing to what you're saying is that, in fact, the metro stations in Kiev are built so far underground with the steel doors that you're referring to that they function not just as a bomb shelter, but as a nuclear fallout shelter.
Yeah.
And then just another one or two more from the metro, just to show you, give you a close-up idea of what it's like to actually live for weeks or months at a time.
Yeah, sad.
I had to be very delicate about photographing people, and this is the other thing that I'm torn, quite honestly, because I'm doing my best, I think, to balance the needs of recording history while maintaining the dignity of people. And I found that there were certain subway stations where people were more accepting of me or other members of the press, whereas others, there was some more open hostility. So I just, felt my way around and went to the places where I felt welcomed.
Okay.
This is one example. It's kind of a close-up, and I felt it was necessary not to show you that you're in a subway station, but this is in a subway station. With all the families with their children, naturally become a little bit more restless and bored than adults. They need some entertainment, they need distractions. And a woman who, I'm not sure if she's a teacher or just a very caring adult happening to take shelter, decided to gather a group of children to read a storybook. And I just found that this kind of camaraderie and resilience was also something that was exhibited in London during the World War II German Blitz on the city. And there were several photographers who spent quite a lot of time photographing the hardy Londoners taking shelter in the subway. And I just felt that there was a connection between what had happened in the 1940s with what's happening here.
If people have got questions, definitely about Ukraine, do put them down in the Q&A box. I'm very happy to take questions early on. We are, in a second, we've got a couple more photos to look at from Ukraine, and then we'll be turning to Haiti, so going on to a different subject. Obviously, all Tim's photos and talking about his approach to photography.
Fortunately, there's only 9 or 10 for each, so a total of 20. We're going to get through it very, very quickly, actually. One thing is, when I was in Kharkiv, and I chose this photograph just to show you, if you notice actually to the left, the windows blacked out. These hospital operating rooms are all on ground level. And as we all know by now, all the type of structures that you think would be off limits to an enemy attack is actually, they are indeed targets, which means schools and hospitals and places of worship and community gathering spaces and so on. And hospitals in particular have been destroyed. However, life goes on and surgeons still need to operate. So what they do is they do it a lot quicker than normal. They bring in a lot more people to assist. Normally, this operation would not have that many nurses and so on. And as soon as they wrap up the operation, they move the patient down into the basement below ground. to recuperate. And then, because the basement itself is so small, they can't accommodate everyone for the necessary recovery period. They need to move everyone out of the hospital completely after 2 days and send them home. So and the stress that the surgeons are operating under is just unimaginable. I think this is the last photograph from Ukraine. And this is one car of people and a dog who had evacuated from a village north of Kharkiv that had just recently been liberated by Ukrainian forces, and they had driven to a meeting point south of Kharkiv for them to be sort of processed, meaning just to for the record takers to keep track of who's leaving. And I just found, I made a lot of photos of the scene of various people and children, but there was something in particular about this photo or this scene with the shrapnel holes on the car and the dog and the lady, and it just seemed a very odd thing that I'd never seen ever in my life as a photojournalist. So that's the last of Ukraine, and we can go on to Haiti unless you would like to take a little break.
When was the last time you were in Ukraine?
I was there in April through May of last year.
Last year, okay. And are you planning to go back again soon?
Well, it really depends. It's I did actually contact all the various clients and the magazines that I've worked with before. They're not exactly assigning that many photographers as they used to. They're looking for people to work on feature stories. And with that being said, that is actually what I'm sort of thinking about. I'm currently doing research about stories while I'm in the United States, only because I prefer not to go without an assignment. It's not the cheapest thing to do freelance. So yes, I want to go, and time will tell if I can, get my ducks in a row.
Yeah, no, it's a tough one. Trying to get your ideas before the editor, and taking the financial risk as well. Okay, well, look, listen, please, everyone, do put your questions. If you've got questions about Ukraine, do put them down. We're about to turn to Haiti. And I'm going to say again, these photographs are disturbing. It's about an earthquake, and there are significant numbers of deaths and injuries, and it's reflective of how the lack of infrastructure and ability to sort of both treat people but also rescue people, and also the nature of the infrastructure within Haiti, that the death tolls are pretty high. I think that the death toll being high, as you say, Nicholas, estimates are up to 250,000 people were killed in a matter of seconds, including people who died of their injuries later on. So let's just make things clear. Which year we took? Because there was one in 2010 and there's one in 2021 as well. 2010. 2010, right. 2010. So this is 12 years ago. But I wanted to include this series of pictures, again, as part of the discussion about logistics and moving around. Of course, this is not the kind of story that requires any kind of research. I mean, it happens, you get on a plane. However, there's also like a significant difference, which we can talk about later, about an active, let's say, world event such as a war, and what your role is as a photographer versus what is my role as a photographer. Like, the event happened, right? The tragedy happened, the natural disaster happened, people are already dead. There's nothing that my photographs can really do to help these people. So, or is there? That's the question. And it's kind of important to appreciate that. So with that being said, and I will say, even though Nick did alert you to the difficult to look photographs, fortunately, in my opinion, there's really only 2 or 3 that are very difficult to look. And I chose the ones that are, if you can call it that, respectful, but there's one with we'll get to it. Essentially, Port-au-Prince, the capital.
It's a capital that is low-lying with buildings that are no more than 2 or 3 stories high. They're usually not very well built. It turns out that the use of rebar it's below normal construction standards. Rebar is very thin, and when the earthquake hit, the buildings just collapsed like, they were made out of powder. So it took a while to start clearing up. But in the meantime, all you had to do was walk around, and this was like a walking story. You would drive from where you were staying and just spend hours on your feet. And unfortunately, there were people trapped alive and dead, of course. And that was my job, just to depict all of this death and destruction, as simple as and as horrifying as that job is. When I came across this scene, I'm grateful for whoever the civilian was who covered the faces of the dead using these mattresses. I just think that a photograph like this is necessary because it gives you the indication of the widespread death toll without actually showing the faces. And I think that's, again, a question that I always try to balance, or a dilemma I balance about maintaining dignity. There'll definitely be a lot of people who will tell me this is not a dignified photograph, and they might be right, but it's a necessary photograph. And this is really the hardest picture you're going to see in the series, but it's the reality of what was happening. There were so many dead, just unbelievable, and they were unidentified. They didn't have identification. They didn't have wallets with them. There were just tons and tons, literally tons of people being buried in unmarked graves, and the only way to transport them to these unmarked graves was by shoveling them and then putting them into a dump truck. As horrible as this is, the reality of how the dead were treated, and there was really no other option. I think that the Haitian health and police authorities were so overwhelmed that they felt that there was a true risk to the remaining living if these decomposing bodies were left out in the open. Of course, I was horrified, but I needed to show the horrified reaction to these scenes by turning the camera away from what we were looking at. And this is always something that I think is extremely important, is to get the reaction, not just show the horror, but actually photograph the reaction to the horror. This is, again, all of these difficult moments. It is among the hardest thing that I can ever do as a journalist, and sometimes I really hate myself, but I have to keep reminding myself how important what my role is. My role, I'm not a counselor. I'm not a police officer. I'm not a medical professional. I can't hug these people because it would be phony. They wouldn't receive me. They wouldn't accept my condolences. So all I can do is what I'm trained for, is to document it visually, as difficult as it is. And this is the other thing. When they couldn't collect, when the authorities, I should say, could not collect the bodies, then civilians took it upon themselves to burn the bodies on the street. And this was happening throughout the city, throughout the capital. The police, who were already overwhelmed, were trying to maintain order, because like any kind of situation where chaos results from a natural disaster or a war, it's not in every situation, obviously, but there can be people who take advantage of the situation. There were definitely people who were looting items that, they were unnecessary, appliances and so on. But I would actually refer to the majority of people as not looters, but they were trying to survive, and they were they didn't have food, and they were going into supermarkets and taking food, and the police were trying to control that situation. There was also no running water because the earthquake destroyed the infrastructure, so people were gathering water from the sewer. As awful as that is, Presumably, they were able to boil it, I hope. But this is the last frame, and I just wanted to, after looking at 10 images of absolute horrible stuff, I wanted our eyes to like remain on a more positive scene. And what was happening here were people who had lost their homes but survived the earthquake, they had nowhere to live. Port-au-Prince was completely destroyed. So they were getting on these boats to neighboring large cities that were not affected by the quake, involving, 2 or 3 hours by boat. So they were loading the children and the babies. And I was there during this evacuation process. And again, I've been to Haiti a lot. I've covered Haiti, Haitian related stories. And for many years, I've been there. This is the 5th time. And like the Ukrainians, the Haitians are very, very strong, willful, generous people. And I think we can all take a lot of inspiration from the Haitians. You just have to go there and see what they're capable of. And this kind of thing is pretty normal. It's not every man for himself, but the community gets together and helps. And that's maybe one of the more inspiring things that I take away from the most horrible of situations.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is it. And I'm going to stop my share.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's pretty, the last set, obviously, deeply, deeply disturbing. How do you cope coming away from that? I mean, you're seeing dead and dying people.
Well, I mean, it's a lot to process. I mean, the effect that witnessing so many deaths can take a real toll. And I think that I have to limit my exposure to being in a situation like that. So I try to keep my time in a country limited to, a month or less. And then when I return to, relative normalcy of, and safety of my hometown, it's, I try to, talk to people, my wife. In the past, I even had, little therapy sessions with professionals to help deal with, the feelings of anger and helplessness that I often have. I think the hardest part is there's always a sense of guilt. And again, even though I rationalize that I'm that professional, I still get to leave.
Yeah.
Whereas they have to remain.
It's a slightly cliche image for me, but I remember coming back from places and having a sense of anger. You go through a supermarket and you see people doing very normal things like taking their kids out or going to the cinema or whatever. And you think these people here don't understand, how can they do this? So there's sort of detachment and I sometimes would feel, and also there's a frustration and anger with that. And you feel slightly set apart from all those people who haven't seen it and experienced it.
To add to what you're saying, yes, this is why I try to do normal and maybe light-hearted photo stories when I'm back home, whether it's in New York or anywhere in the U.S. or really anywhere. There's, a form of therapy by just going through the motions of, making photographs of, or, doing a portrait assignment once in a while. I think it's really vital for me. I mean, maybe some people are wired differently and they can process horrible events over and over again without it affecting them long term. I don't think I'm one of those people. So I just have to, sort of put my foot into these really bad situations a little bit more irregularly.
The, conflict is, in terms of it's one of the things you're best known for, but increasingly, I think you focused a lot more on stories that tell stories about people's daily lives and the lives that we don't see. And I want to sort of jump in if I can, and I think I'm going to actually share, and everyone here watching can do this too, which is to go to Tim's own webpage. So I'm going to bring it up here. So it is simply, I think it's just timothyfadek.com, isn't it, Tim?
That's correct.
Yeah. So, well, I want to take Mongolia, and then I think I want you to talk about the Sawalki Gap. First of all, just on photographically, the colours here are really stunning on this. How do you manage to get such vivid colours?
It's, I mean, the colors coming out of the camera is kind of a direct result of the camera that I was using back then. It was a Canon camera that had very vivid reds and very vivid colors,
Yeah.
but also when a photographer like myself shooting in what's called a RAW format, you need to bring out the contrast and the colors in post-production. So if you're using Photoshop or whatever software, you add a little bit of contrast, a little bit of saturation, you sharpen the image slightly. But the lens that I happen to use for pretty much the entirety of that story, it's an amazing lens, which I still use. It's a 35 millimeter lens with a very wide open aperture, which is 1.4. But it's the glass is, as we call it, is unbelievably sharp. And there's just something really special about this particular lens that I still use for the majority of my work. And it's the most important thing you can ever buy is a lens. And that was a very, very expensive lens. We're talking, and I really insist that I mention this. It's a $2,000 lens, and it's much more important than the camera.
Wow.
Yeah.
Also, what I like about this, let's talk now again about the story here. And this is Mongolia. I mean, the people who travel this have traveled in a lot of places, but you're able to tell a story about a country in transition and getting into places that you might not expect. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, that's actually part of the whole like planning and research thing that I wanted to talk about. So I happen to, be an avid, call it news junkie. I devour all things, and I don't just read the New York Times or whatever. I try to go to, magazines like, like Foreign Policy or the Council of Foreign Relations. I read, Business Week and other business publications, the Wall Street Journal I read. And very often, I'll read a story that has no photographs. And in the case of Mongolia, I was reading about Mongolia multiple times. It was always popping up in various business publications how, after the end of the Soviet domination of the country, they turned to Canadian and South African mining companies to help them extract the gold and copper that was deep underneath. And finally, after roughly 2 decades of this, they were finally extracting the copper ore and the gold ore. And it was almost like night and day, transforming the country from this really poor nomadic civilization to one where people started having, fancy cars and nicer apartments and money to spend. And but I hadn't seen a single photograph. And so I without doing a whole lot of research, and you can't really, because you don't know what to expect, I jumped on a plane, went to Ulaanbaatar, was able to connect with a person who acted as my language interpreter / fixer, although he wasn't much of a fixer. He acted mostly as my language interpreter. And we just went around, not every day with him. I would often just walk around on my own, and that's what I preferred, actually. Just photographing daily life. And I think the daily life part.
These are heating pipes, aren't they? City heating pipes, or going underneath the bridge. That's
correct. Yes, that's correct. Some kind of water pipes, I'm presumably heating. It's just, this is the Tool River, the main river that runs through. And, Mongolia is a landlocked country, and there's only limited access to the water. And again, this is a very Soviet thing where the Soviets would do stuff like this, pipes everywhere when you least expect it. But again, not everything has to be planned. And with Mongolia, it was finally, and by the way, I was able to do it on my own financially because it was not terribly expensive to operate there. And it was widely published in maybe 6-7 publications, including Time Magazine. But it was really important to show a country in transition. And I made 2 trips, each about a month long. it was really a 2-month story. It takes a long time to really dig. This is a photograph of a teenager in prison. Alcohol and drug addiction is a big problem. Alcoholism and drug addiction in the capital, especially. And it was basically an overall view of daily life and here we have them embracing Western wedding standards. In the past, wearing white as a gown was not typical. They suddenly have televisions and they're watching, and they're embracing the Western world. This is all part of the accumulation of wealth. And so going to the so-called wedding factory, I guess that's the best name I can call it, where you had multiple weddings taking place on a given day. And it's always the same.
I'm going to switch to another story now.
Yep.
This is, which I really enjoy your take of. Here's the main story. Everyone's focused on this, but you have a way in that gives people context and has a better understanding of what's going on elsewhere. We've had people go through Ukraine and also through the Baltics. We've been going since 2014. And so many of the people watching here will be familiar with the Suwalki Gap. But for those who are not familiar, Tim, what is the Suwalki Gap?
It's named after Suwalki, which is a tiny Polish city. The gap itself is a 100-kilometer long or 60-mile long border between northeast Poland and Lithuania, and Lithuania being the western country out of the three Baltic countries. And the theory goes, if you're a military strategist and planner, that all one has to do is roll tanks across this or along this 60-mile long border to effectively physically seal it off from the rest of Europe. So you could effectively seal off Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia from the rest of Europe. And all these countries are NATO, right? But would NATO actually want to do something? Should there be a Russian military strategy to seal off? And
just to state the obvious, Kaliningrad is there. So you've got the Baltic states, the three Baltic states, and then immediately underneath what was
and you have Belarus.
Kaliningrad. And
yeah, that's right. Yeah, you have Kaliningrad, which is Russia. Then you have the Russian ally Belarus, and in between is a pretty tiny border. And I wanted to know what the border was. What is this threat to the Suwalki Gap? What is this threat? And so there's two sets of photographs basically showing the region itself. And again, this is a story that I read about, and there were no photographs. And I spent a few weeks just tooling around by car. I rented a car. And all of this is just basically farmland. There's nothing significant about it. This is Suwalki itself. So I went to the church on a Sunday. That's people living there.
Catholic Poland.
Correct, Catholic.
Yeah.
There's there are Polish training nearby, and they do basic things like shopping. People living in Suwalki.
I love it.
This is the thing that I prefer not to go into a story, as if you call it, already coming up with the images of my story. However, I try to meet family members just to see how they live. And like the old lady with the funny thing, you come across odd situations, which I think are charming and part of the story. Daily life, young couples, that kind of thing. Farmers. And all of these photographs are just basically to give the viewer who'd never been to the Suwalki Gap an idea of what it's like there. These are training. This is Polish tank commanders, and these are Americans training working with the Poles, I should say. Again, with an effort to secure the Suwalki Gap. And then this is a typical Polish forest of birch trees and Polish soldiers at attention while their president is speaking. And this is, again, it's not highly militarized, but it was important to show the military aspect and balance the the civilian aspect as well. And the
Well, we're
odd
gonna do
thing, or the
conversation
difficult
about
thing-
tanks. Do you know what tanks those are? There's, I think you're on top of, there's on top of an Abrams, but in the background, what have you got?
I don't know the type of tank it is, but it could be an Abrams.
Hmm.
I'm not entirely sure.
Okay,
There
we go.
Oh, this is the most important thing. It's to actually show you. I've been struggling with this. I was like, you know what? Let's just show a map, and I think people can get that very well.
Great.
Yeah. But again, it's a weird story because there's nothing actually happening. It's one of those like theoretical stories. And I thought, this is a kind of a challenging story visually. And I have nothing else going on. So I'm going to jump on the story and I'm going to make a story out of it.
We've been speaking for the best part of an hour. If people have got questions, you need to jump in now because we're going to stop soon. So if you've got any questions, anybody, do jump in. I've got tons more that I can discuss with Tim, but everyone, it's about you being able to put your questions to him. Just looking at the stories from on the left-hand side, we just see the huge range of stuff that you've done. The sitting of the missing woman in Juarez in Mexico, that's a strong story. We hear about that, but again, that brings it to life in images. There's very strong photographs from Egypt and the revolution. I know from your work there, you're right there among the demonstrators. I'm actually going to pick on that one just while we've got it there. Here's a question, Tim. I know that you told your wife, I think you told your wife that you were going to stop.
Well, I got to tell you, I did for a while, and then I get pulled back into it because the Arab Spring is such an earth-shattering series of events among different countries that what was taking place in Egypt was hard to ignore. But it's always a conversation I have with my wife, and it's really important to have this conversation. I can't just say I'll be back in a month. You got to talk. And she, let's call it, gave her blessing, and it was like, yeah, I understand what you're all about. Just go. She knows I won't be happy sitting at home watching it on TV. And I was working for Time magazine, by the way.
Yeah, is that to say you can't stop?
Oh boy, at some point I will stop. But I feel like it's part of my DNA. It's like my contribution, my tiny little contribution to society. My tiny little contribution to news gathering.
Yeah. Okay. Geraldine Gill has got a question there, I think. Jerry, you there? Jerry, you're a photographer.
Excuse me, yes. Yeah. I just wanted to say wonderful work. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm envious.
Thank you.
Well, Tim, I think Jerry is. I can say this, Jerry. You're not stopping. You're not giving up, Jerry, are you?
I'm sorry?
You're not giving up taking photos, are you?
I'm trying not to, but I can't do this stuff anymore. So.
Yeah, we took Jerry on we do tours in Israel and Palestine, and she took a great series of photos there in the West Bank and also in Israel, and then had an exhibition back in Houston. We've got many photographers among our followers there too. Diane, have you got any more questions? I've got Diane Cook there too.
No, just more in the same vein. I mean, I'm very envious of your lens, Timothy, because I was really struck by the clarity of your pictures from Ukraine, particularly at the beginning.
Yeah,
it was absolutely amazing.
And then to wrap up, I'm going to take one more story, which is a slightly different story, and this is this one here, this is New York, is it, Tim?
It is, and it's actually, I'm really glad you decided to show it because it's a representation of what I was saying, that after I come back from a harrowing, emotionally fraught story, I need to work because I just love photography so much. And I think that it's really important to do something that's really fun. And this was about a dive bar, a beloved bar in New York that was closing, one that I frequented very, very often when I was in photography school.
Whereabouts was it?
59th Street, no, 60th Street and Lexington Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, near the Bloomingdale's department store. And it had been around for 73 years, and it was also tied into this story of real estate development and New York becoming commercial and losing items of its, like, elements of its charm. And while I'm sure there's many people out here who probably don't agree with, spending time in bars, and that's fine. This particular one, like so many dive bars, is sort of pseudo-functioning community center. So there are those people who might prefer going to church, and these people prefer hanging out in a bar booth. But what I loved about this particular bar is that it was kind of like a democracy of various people from various demographics, old and young, those unemployed and those with jobs, male and female, men in suits, men wearing baseball caps. There wasn't, like, I wouldn't say there was, a ton of debauchery. There was definitely, lots of, male preening and women drinking, but it was just like a fun place. And it's just something that I, as a native New Yorker, I felt kind of sad that this was disappearing. And soon after, and also I talked to the owners of the bar asking permission, and they said, do whatever you want. You're welcome here. And the photographs were published in the New York Times. They were published in the Village Voice and a few other places. But again, in many ways, even though the story is roughly 7 years old, it's when the bar closed. I'm sure that in 20 years or more, these photos will have a different significance, showing a New York that no longer exists. And that's a part of also, like, the long-term thinking about what's so cool about being a photojournalist is freezing time and moments that won't exist later on. And it was a lot of fun doing it. And I spent maybe, I don't know, it was like twice a week for 5 months going there. Whenever I had some free time, and I would leave early if there was nothing happening, or if the people were dancing, I would stay until 2 a.m. Sometimes I showed up in the early afternoon to check it out. Really, whenever it was the kind of story that I just kind of fit in during available hours, basically. If I was coming home from another assignment, I would stop in at the bar. I also would have a beer with these people. So it was kind of nice for me personally to, like, wind down my evening from an assignment. I would have a beer, I would sit down, I would talk to these people in the booth, and I would have my camera ready. And at the right moment, if there was, like, something tender like here, I would make a picture or some, people were really cool with me. Once they got to know me as the guy with the camera, I could move around almost invisibly.
Tim, I always think that you never, almost journalism is sort of like a sort of psychological state as well as a identity, and you never lose that desire to look at what the story is. I always want to know, even if it's in my local town, why things are happening, why does this happen in this particular way? I'm always asking that question, and I guess in a way, as a photographer, you're doing the same. Sheila de Balaguer's got one more question. Go ahead, Sheila.
Hi, hello, Timothy. Well, I think that you're making a terrific record. I'm an archivist by training, and I just think it's very important what you're doing, and terrific photos. I was just going to ask if it's indiscreet to ask what you might be planning next as a project.
Oh,
Gone.
I don't know if that's me or
Professionally, about 1 year ago, and I'm working on these, like, little mini documentaries for clients like Bloomberg and CNN. The video is quite different because it's two things. It involves a different way of thinking. With photography, you're just basically grabbing moments out of the air, and with video, you have to think about sequencing and time. Plus, there's a technical aspect that I'm trying to learn, and I don't have time nor the money to enroll for 4 years or 2 years in film school. So I'm kind of teaching myself like on the job. So it's a general thing. I don't have a particular project in mind, but I think it might be preparation for one day working on a documentary of my own. I don't really know. But right now I'm kind of fascinated with the process of video, and we'll see what happens.
Well, Tim, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been a really good overview. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I know we could keep on talking and keep on looking. Please do go and have a look at everyone at Tim's website. It's timothyfadek.com, and all the stories that we've just been looking at there are online there. Thank you very much indeed, Tim. It's been really good.
Nicholas, thank you so much for having me on. It was a real pleasure.